Morning, everyone. This is Bill Helmich with Bill Helmich Associates. We are live streaming our seminar on purchasing and COVID-19. These are issues that tribes are now facing with the emergency situation with COVID-19 and having to acquire goods and services with federal funds. The issue that the tribes face is how to ensure that their purchases are in compliance with applicable federal law and that they are done in an expeditious, timely manner so as to respond to the needs of the tribe. Just as a couple of reminders, in order to activate the webinar, you'll need to hit the subscribe button, and there are 4 links on the startup screen at the bottom. 2 links from FEMA, 1 link from the Office of Management and Budget, and a copy of the Super Circular 2 CFR 200. If you want to submit any questions, please enter them in the chat box on the right-hand side. They will come up and I will submit them back to you. Also, if you want to be put on our mailing list for future presentations, please send us your email to bhelmich@flash.net, and we will make sure that you are informed of any future webinars or on-sites or public classes. Okay, to get started here, one of the major concepts that tribes face is that when they receive a federal award, that federal award incorporates the laws that they are subject to by citation. I'll do a little bit of a graphic to show you what I mean here. Imagine that your federal award is an iceberg floating in the water. The award document is the tip of the iceberg that you see. However, it doesn't represent the entire citation or documents that apply to you. I've given you an example on the PowerPoint slide here of an actual EPA grant award document. And it was in the administrative conditions for the grant, and it cited that the tribe would comply with some EPA regulations, and it also said 2 CFR 200. So what has happened here is that laws have been incorporated by citation. There are 3 possible scenarios here where how those laws can be incorporated. The first scenario would be the law will be cited, and that will be the end of it. Law cited. The second pathway is a little more complex. And what will happen is a law will be cited, but it in turn will incorporate other laws at multiple levels down below it. And that's what's happening here with 2 CFR 200. So this 2 CFR in turn cites 2 other laws, which I'll illustrate here in a little bit. The third pathway is somewhat ambiguous in a little bit, because it's not explicitly cited, but the laws still apply because they are applicable laws. So you have three different ways that laws can be incorporated by citation. The first would be directly to the law. The second would be laws incorporated at multiple levels. And the third way would be applicable laws that are not cited but are still applicable. Okay. That's the first concept that I wanted to illustrate. The second concept, when you look at these laws, and I'm going to focus in on 2 CFR. When you look at 2 CFR 200, fill in the rest of my iceberg, what you'll find is that, and you look at the federal procurement rules that are incorporated in 2 CFR 200. On the PowerPoint slide, I gave you an excerpt from one of the regulations in 2 CFR 200. In this case, 200.318. And you'll notice the regulation says that when the tribe develops its procurement procedures, they have to reflect tribal law. However, you can't just stop reading the citation at that comma. You have to continue with the next phrase starting with the word provided. And it says that provided that the tribal procurements comply or conform to 2 other citations, applicable federal law and the standards in this section. Okay, taking that, you've got 3 items. And what this is doing is it's forming what I call an order of precedence. And what I mean by that is that if you look at one item, let's say item number 3, which I haven't put up on the screen yet, if it is in conflict with a higher item, it has to conform with higher law. So the rule here is you must conform to higher law. Okay, now, in the case of procurement, when we look at these 3, the first one is going to be federal law, which comes from a document called the FAR, or 48 CFR. The second one is 2 CFR 200, and for our purposes here, the section within Part 200 is paragraphs 317 to 326. And then on the bottom of that hierarchy would be tribal law. Now, there's 2 consequences from what I just said and what we've got on the board here. First consequence is that you need to conform to higher law. So if there's a conflict between tribal procurement policy and 2 CFR 200, you need to make sure that you conform to 2 CFR 200. And by extrapolation to 48 CFR. But it also has a second ramification. if there is a conflict, you also have to change tribal law to comply. And our concern here today is that we want to make sure that we comply with 2 CFR 200 and 48 CFR when we're doing purchases in the COVID-19 circumstances that we're now facing. Okay, now let me erase this. There's an underlying principle that applies to purchasing in a normal situation. And I gave you in the PowerPoint slide 2 paragraph citation which are taken from 2 CFR 200. Paragraph number, 319, competition. And I'm going to excerpt those and paraphrase them slightly up on the whiteboard. And I'm going to put them in 3 separate lines. Normally, what you would be doing when you're using federal funds is to maximize full, free, and open competition. Now, the word competition has a technical meaning when you're using federal funds. And the interpretation of that one word in these 3 phrases here is that you must seek to obtain 2 or more independent contractors who are able to compete for your requirement. Now, that situation applies to us when we're not facing a emergency or a disaster, natural disaster. And in that context, whenever you seek to obtain that competition, you have to ensure that the competitors that you seek are full, free, and open, and that you're doing so to obtain the maximum amount of competition that you can. Now, taking that one word, maximize, and in the new super circular, what the federal government has done is to establish 3 different procurement zones. The first zone is what is called the micro zone. Actually, what I'll do here is I'll put it down at the bottom and do it graphically. So down here, you have the micro zone. Now, actually, when you do the hierarchy of law and you research what micro is defined as by going from the 2 CFR 200 definition to the FAR, you find that micro purchases have actually been subdivided into 3 separate zones. So I'll do it this way. Construction, services, materials and equipment. Now what happened here is in November of 2018, Congress passed the National Defense Appropriation Act, and it changed the definition of the procurement zones. And what happened was the micro purchase zone definition was raised from $3,000 to $10,000. However, when you look at the other laws, in this case, Construction Contracting and the Service Contract Act, they also retain those original definitions. And so construction was defined to be up to 2,000, services 2,500, and materials and supplies was raised to 10,000. Now, what this means for you, for micro purchases, all the tribe has to do is obtain one quote. So, if we put here one quote. So by law, the phrase maximize full, free, and open competition for micro meant one. And you really don't have competition until you get above the micro threshold. Now, looking at what I've got here, $2,000 for construction. Before you go ahead and do the procurement, you would estimate how much it's going to cost. So let's say that because of COVID-19, you need to do a renovation of a facility. You estimate that it's going to cost $1,500. All you need to do is obtain one quote because it's under $2,000. Now, if it were estimated to be over $2,000, that puts us into what's called the small purchase zone. Small purchase is above these lines, which I'll kind of graphically illustrate here. It's above those lines, and if it gets into that threshold, now we run into a situation where the principle of procurement is maximizing full, free, and open competition. And now what we have to do is seek to obtain, and I'll write it this way, contact at least 3. Super Circular 2 CFR 200 actually says make sure you have quote-unquote adequate competition. But because of the hierarchy of law and the 48 CFR being above the Super Circular, that means you go to the Super Circular and you read the law there, and that's where it says you must contact at least 3. Now, in a competitive environment, we would seek to obtain at least 2 out of the 3 that we've contacted. Now, you're not constrained to contact only 3. You can contact more. I'll get into a situation that we're facing because of COVID-19 in just a little bit. Now, I mentioned just a little bit ago about how the National Defense Appropriation Act changed the threshold. Under the Super Circular, this line was established at $150,000. When the National Defense Appropriation Act was passed, it raised that threshold to $250,000. Now, what this means for the tribe is that if you look at those two thresholds, the tribe can, if they so desire, change their policy to raise their threshold up to that level. So you can raise your threshold for purchasing materials and supplies, if you so desire, up to 10,000, which would mean up to 10,000 you would need to obtain only one quote. You can raise your small purchase threshold up to 250,000, which would mean that you would only need to obtain 3 quotes up to 250,000. You're not required to raise them to that level, but you cannot exceed that level either. Now, if you raise your small purchase threshold and we get into what is called the major purchases, the main impact upon you here is that you're going to have to obtain competition 2 ways: advertising and, I'll put a bullet there, contacting known vendors. Now, one little stipulation here, or caveat: you cannot just contact those vendors that you know. You also must, in turn, advertise as well. Now, given the circumstances that we are currently facing, I'm going to suggest that we have some options here, but I'm also going to say that there are certain constraints on that. So these are the zones of competition, and clarify the word maximize. Now, within those zones, we're going to use either competitive procedures or non-competitive. And non-competitive procedures are what we're facing here potentially under COVID-19. By the way, just as a little side note, the word COVID stands for coronavirus disease -19 for 2019 when it was first identified. Okay, now, if we had the luxury, let's say, of doing competitive procurement, in small purchases, as I mentioned earlier, we would seek to obtain at least 3 quotes. The hierarchy of law, 48 CFR, the applicable section within 48 CFR is Part 13. And for purchases of equipment, materials, and supplies, we would seek at least 3 quotes. If we were trying to buy services, we would seek to obtain 3 proposals. Once we go over the major purchase threshold, now we're faced with a unlimited competition, which we either obtain with advertising coupled with contacting known, or contacting known and advertising at least statewide. Okay. However, why would we be using non-competitive proposals? Okay. Let me put up a couple of notes here up on the whiteboard. As I stated earlier, the underlying principle was to maximize competition. However, let me qualify that now and say unless. And there are 3 situations defined in law, meaning in 2 CFR 200, that allow us to use other than competitive procedures. The first situation is if there is only one contractor available. And this, I amended that on the PowerPoint, added emphasis there by inserting the word known into that phrase, which requires that you actually do due diligence to determine if there is more than one or not. We have a question from the viewers.
Dallas Reed asked the question, can you please explain the dollar amounts and the number of quotes for tribes and small purchases again when you get a chance?
Okay. Let me go ahead and see if I can do it a little bit clearer. Question was from Dallas
Reed.
Dallas Reed, I apologize. Micro, let me do this one by itself. Originally, when the law was passed, there was a citation limit of $3,000 for micro. As I mentioned, Congress amended that threshold to raise it to $10,000, but when they made that amendment to the law, they only amended it for one of the kinds of things that you would buy. So, it's $10,000 for materials, supplies, and equipment. So let me give you an example to illustrate my point here. Suppose that you wanted to go out and buy an all-terrain vehicle. You estimate that it's going to cost $11,500 for an all-terrain vehicle. You'll notice all-terrain vehicle would fall into the equipment category, for which we have a $10,000 threshold. But the estimate, which before we do the purchase, is $10,000. Since that estimate is over the $10,000, and let me make a note here, if over, then we must contact 3. Now, let's suppose, second illustration with that same threshold. Suppose that you are going out and you are buying supply items. Let's say you're buying copy paper for the tribe. And you estimate for all of the copiers in the tribe that the copy paper that you're going to buy is going to cost $7,400. That's under the $10,000. Since it's under, then you only need to contact 1. Because it's under the $10,000 threshold for materials, supplies, and equipment. Now, let me go back to the National Defense Appropriation Act, which I said happened in the fall of 2018. When that was passed, that was after the 2 CFR 200 had come out, the Office of Management and Budget issued a memo in June 20th of 2019 and said that tribes could raise their threshold to $10,000 pursuant to the definitions of a micro threshold found in 48 CFR. Okay, so Let's erase this. And micro is defined in 48 CFR 2.101. And when you look this up, the National Defense Appropriation Act did not change all of the definitions found in 2.101. It left two definitions unchanged. For services, the threshold, because it was defined by the Service Contract Act, not by the National Defense Appropriation Act. And the National Defense Appropriation Act did not change the threshold for services. So let's say that you need to have a vehicle serviced that the tribe owns. And you go in and you contact a dealership and they say, we estimate that it's going to cost $3,200. If it's over $2,500, you must get 3. If it's under, you have to get only 1. And a similar analogy applies if you have construction. Only construction definition is 2,000 instead of 2,500. We have another question from viewer.
Jeannie Fletcher. Along these lines, does this apply to bulk supply ordering that we are faced with at the moment? That's the first part of her question. Second part, would the threshold apply to individual price or overall bulk order amount?
Repeat the second question.
Okay, the first part was, does this apply to bulk supply ordering that we are faced with at the moment? That's the first part. Second part, would the threshold apply to individual price or the overall bulk order amount?
Okay, thank you for your question. I'm going to answer the second part of that question first. When you're buying something, you look at it as the aggregate purchase. So it's all of the items lumped together that you're determining what the aggregate price is. Now, let me go back and add the word in that I had started to do here. Maximize competition unless. Now, the first part of that question was, if you're making bulk purchases in the current situation that you're faced with. This is where we now are looking at COVID-19 issues. And COVID-19 permits us to do emergency or unusual compelling urgency circumstances where we are allowed to go out without competition. Let me change and introduce a couple of things for this. PowerPoint slide. On March 13th, President Trump issued an emergency declaration for all 50 states and the territories within the United States. Therefore, the governors did not have to request individual state emergency declarations. Given that declaration and the subsequent consequences, we have two situations that we're now confronted with. Go back to our underlying principle here. Normally, we would maximize competition unless two things occur. One, we have a public exigency, or we have an emergency. Now, you'll notice in the PowerPoint slide here, I put up a definition, and I'll show you the definition for both of these words here in just a second. There is a federal definition of these two terms. And I want to do a little bit of a kind of a corollary here first. Lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency or an exigency. So if this is something, to answer Jeannie's question here, that we could have planned for, then you would not be construed to have either a public exigency or an emergency situation. Now, in both of these circumstances, the reason why we're allowed to not have competition is because you cannot, and I'll say it somewhat concisely, you cannot wait to get competition. Imagine the scenario where you're going to, and I'll come back to her question again. You need to make a bulk purchase. Now let's hypothesize, and she didn't stipulate what it was that she wanted to buy, but let's say that it was personal protective equipment, or PPE. If the purchase is over the $10,000 threshold, then we would have, under normal circumstances, we would have to obtain at least 3 quotes. But the question was asked, we need to make a bulk purchase under the current circumstances. Now, let's say we need personal protective equipment. If we were to do this normally, we'd have to develop a requisition. We would then have to identify at least 3 vendors. We would have to contact those 3 vendors. We would have to wait for those vendors to respond. We would have to then evaluate, and then we would have to issue an award. Conservatively, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Can we afford to wait 2 to 3 weeks to acquire these bulk supplies? If the answer is no, then we are not required to have maximum competition. Okay, we have another question.
Jeannie Fletcher asked, again, she has a different focus, buying isolation gowns for our households that are isolated. 1 gown case is $23.65. We are purchasing 8,033 cases for an amount of $21,285. Will 3 quotes suffice, or showing that no one else has any of these in stock?
Thank you for your question again. And I'm going to postulate again, if we were in a normal circumstance here, where we would have to maximize competition, considering that you're over 10,000, the answer would be 3 quotes would be sufficient. If you know more than 3, you can contact more than 3. However, how urgently do you need these protective gowns? If you stipulate and you can justify that because of the circumstances here and the necessity to protect tribal members, we need that personal protective gown right now, then I'm going to say to you, it's either a public exigency or an emergency, and if so, contact 1. Public exigency, emergency situations allow us to not have to get competition. So in the circumstance that you described, where the estimated cost is $21,000 plus, but if the urgency is such a magnitude that you need them right away, and the vendor is capable of getting them to you right away, then all you have to do is contact one of the known vendors that are out there. Okay, now, let's go back to those two definitions. Public exigency. One way of paraphrasing that phrase a little bit is that your public exigency occurs and it creates the potential for harming the public welfare, causing injury or harm to the entity, not necessarily to individuals within the organization, but to the organization itself. A good example of a situation that happened a couple years back, one of the tribes in South Dakota during Christmas break had a water main break in one of their schools. Nobody was harmed. No individual's life, health, or safety was impacted. But the ability to conduct school, i.e. the public welfare, was what was harmed, and therefore you had a public exigency. Okay, let's go to the second definition here. And again, I want to preface here these two definitions. The comment, these are federal definitions. They're not tribal ones. And because of the hierarchy of law, we have to be able to demonstrate that we have met the federal definition. Now, President has declared an emergency, but when you go out and do purchasing, you're going to have to justify sole source by saying that the acquisition needs to be done with one vendor because of an imminent threat to the life, health, or safety of the members of the tribe. So if I go back to the question that Jeannie asked, Jeannie Fletcher, and she says, personal protective equipment, the gowns, we needed to buy $21,000 plus of those gowns. Now, that's only one of the pieces of personal protective equipment. You're also talking masks and face shields, etc. And all of those, of course, increase the aggregate amount of the purchase. All of them are needed to protect the life, health, and safety of the members. That would constitute an emergency, in which case you would not need to go out and maximize competition. Why? Because we have met the criteria for these two definitions. Okay, let's go to the next slide, or PowerPoint slide. In order for this to be allowable, however, there are certain criteria that have to be met. saying that we have an emergency or an exigency doesn't make it so. There was a circumstance that happened with a tribe in the Midwest where one of the schools went and did an emergency purchase because they ran out of toilet paper. Now, in the current situation, that's perhaps understandable because people were hoarding toilet paper. But this occurred 2 to 3 years ago when we didn't have the COVID-19 emergency situation. So, in reality, 2 to 3 years ago, running out of toilet paper was merely an illustration of a lack of planning and would not constitute an emergency and would not be justification for doing a sole source. So, if we have exigent or emergency circumstances, we have to have a justification. Now, on your subscription screen, I gave you 4 citations or links that you can download by clicking on those links, which I recommend you do after this is over with. And in the FEMA fact sheet, one of the things that they require is that you have to provide a justification. Now, the justification is going to show why do you need that? Well, the need in almost all cases is because of urgency. Now, again, as I stipulated earlier, when we're looking at procurement with federal funds, and I mentioned to you at the beginning something called the hierarchy of law, I stipulated that at the top of that hierarchy, top of the order of precedence, was 48 CFR. In this case, urgency situations have been defined by 48 CFR as per 48 CFR 6.302-2. Now, there's a couple of stipulations in reference to that definition. Now, we have to rely, because we're using federal funds here, we have to rely on, and your policy document should incorporate these citations or wording in order to be in compliance. Compelling urgency means in this case that you can't wait. So that's what precludes the competition. Delay, if we delayed, it would result, and you would describe the impact of the delay. In this case, in order to be an urgency situation or emergency, we would have to say we cannot wait, because if we do, someone literally might die. And we would do that as our rationale. Now, there's a couple of caveats that apply to this. When you prepare the justification, and you look at the reg that I cited here, if you read the continue down, there's a statement that says, once you've made that sole source purchase and you've fulfilled your requirement, a future need would probably, in all likelihood, not have the same compelling urgency. So, entering into another contract, and I'm going to make a note here, subsequent purchase must be competitive. Why? During the time that you're buying the items that you require sole source, and you have this compelling urgency, or you have the potential for harm to life, health, or safety, and you describe what the impact of that delay is, that only happens during the circumstances when that delay would cause harm. Once that delay, once that acquisition has been obtained and you've fulfilled the requirement, then the work performed has met the urgency. And subsequent to that, you will be able to go out and do competitive purchasing because you fulfilled the urgent need requirement. Now, one of the things that FEMA has stipulated in the fact sheet here is that you must document merely stating that we have an emergency is not sufficient. We have to be able to say that the urgency is of a compelling nature, that it's going to cause harm to somebody's life or the welfare of the organization within that time frame. Okay, now, the FAR has also, and I gave you the citation for the compelling urgency, but there's also a citation for an emergency, which I want to put up as well. And again, the same parameters apply. Emergency is per 48 CFR, in this case 18.203. Which in our case here, we have an emergency because the president has so declared. Now, the tribe, however, needs to submit a declaration as to how such an emergency is impacting the tribe, and that there are COVID-19 infestations occurring within the tribe as well. And what this would necessitate, as what some of the tribes have done, is to submit an emergency declaration to FEMA as well. Under the Stafford Act, as discussed in our first live stream presentation, tribes can also declare an emergency, and in this case COVID-19, provided that it is impacting the tribe, would warrant the tribal chairman or governor or president or chief declaring an emergency, submitting that declaration to FEMA, and having it be endorsed by the federal government. And therefore, under the Stafford Act, tribes can also declare that we have an emergency, which creates a situation of compelling urgency. Okay. Going to the next element. When you prepare your justification, there are certain factors that have to be incorporated into it. There's a PowerPoint slide up on your screen. The justification elements consist of why you would have to incorporate these. Now, let's do the contrast or the corollary here. Let's say you do not have a justification or you don't have these elements incorporated into your document. If that's the case then, and you were applying for FEMA funding, FEMA has stated that they would disallow such funding because of inadequate justification. Okay. Some of these elements, as I stated earlier, describe the need, define how this delay is going to impact you. What is the product or service that you require in order to address that need, and why is that product of such a compelling urgency? And what would be the likely time frame that would take place if you were to have to do it in a competitive environment? Now bear in mind that if this were a micro purchase, we would only need one contractor anyway, so you wouldn't have to do competition. But once we go above the micro threshold or the major threshold, now we need the emergency or exigent circumstances justification. Now, you notice there's a couple of other items that were added to this justification document. One of the ones I found very interesting, FEMA requires, and there's a couple of circumstances here. There's an OMB memo of March 9th of this year. And in that memo, OMB authorizes the tribe to use what are called local funding or local vendor sources. And they abbreviated the competitive environment requirements. And they are allowed to use local sources. Now, if that were the case, those local sources, if there were more than one, why are you only using one when there are more than one locally? Well, here in the local situation, especially in tribes throughout the United States, there is the potential for a conflict of interest. So, FEMA requires, and so does 2 CFR 200, to identify with the single source conflicts of interest. Now, conflicts of interest are defined in 2 CFR 200, and conflicts of interest occur when the vendor potentially has a familial or financial interest in one of the parties of the tribe who's involved in that procurement process. For example, let's say that one of the suppliers is related to the buyer within the tribe. I'm not saying that you're not permitted to do that purchase. You may be permitted, provided that you declare the conflict of interest and you identify what procedures you're using to ensure that the conflict is not resulting in unwarranted personal or financial gain. Now, there may also be other justifying elements that you would incorporate in your justification. Many of the tribes today, the circumstances that you face are geographic isolation. So, and I'll use demographic factors should also be described, including such as geographic isolation. Many of the tribes, because of that isolation, there are oftentimes some vendors who are unwilling to go to the tribe because of the distance involved, or perhaps because of past history and interaction between the tribe and those vendors has created a, let's say, hostile environment. In that case, make sure you stipulate those factors as part of your justification document. Now, there's another little criteria here that I'm going to add, and I found this one somewhat kind of unique and interesting given COVID-19. Go back to the question which one of you posed to me. We made a bulk purchase of protective gowns, $21,000 plus. I don't remember the quantity, but suppose we made that purchase, and then subsequent to that, we need to go out and we need to make another purchase. And for whatever the rationale, we still want to do sole source. What FEMA has stipulated, each sole source with COVID requires a separate justification. Now, the premise behind this is that when you made that first purchase and it's in process and you're expecting and you're receiving the delivery of the items, and you know that you're going to need some more in the future, why aren't you at that time instituting a competitive procurement for the follow-on acquisition? Now, let's hypothesize that you didn't initiate that competitive acquisition. Doesn't that illustrate lack of planning on your part? And lack of planning does not warrant an emergency exigent purchase. So, if you find that you have to do a second follow-on sole source, you had better have a separate justification, and in that justification you'd better be able to show why you weren't able to foresee the follow-on acquisition. So, separate justification and stipulate that you could not foresee the need for a subsequent purchase. Okay, now we're going to do a sole source purchase. I put up another PowerPoint slide here for you about the elements that should be incorporated into the contract with the vendor. Yes, you've justified the sole source. Now you award that sole source contract. And given the fact that it was either a small purchase or a major purchase, you enter into a contractual relationship. Well, the contract, by law, under both 2 CFR 200 and under 48 CFR, has to have certain elements. The first thing it has to have are certain clauses. Now, given that this is a procurement using federal funds, given that it's sole source, you need to go to Appendix 2 of 2 CFR 200. And there are mandatory clauses that are required. Now, let's just hypothesize that because of the circumstances that we had to do construction type activity. One of the things that we have to do then, and it is a mandatory requirement, is that there are 3 types of bonding clauses that are required by law. There is a bid bond, there is a performance bond, and a payment bond if construction is entailed. Now, before you award, you must analyze contractor responsibility. Now, this word is asking you the question, does this contractor have the capability of doing the work that you are asking for? Now, one of the components of that is, are they debarred? One of the requirements of 2 CFR 200 is that you are supposed to do a System for Award Management, or SAM, debarment background check. All you do is you go on the web page for the federal government System for Award Management, and you do a background check. I would encourage you also, however, to ask the contractor to submit a debarment cert declaration. Now, the reason for your asking the contractor to submit a certification is that you get more information about this contractor's background than you get off of the federal government's website. For example, you would also ask the contractor, when they submit the cert, to say, have they ever been debarred by the state? Which SAM.gov does not define. You would also ask the contractor to certify, have they been debarred by a tribe? Which again, SAM does not show. You will also find out whether this contractor has ever been convicted of what are called white-collar crimes. And finally, you would find out whether this contractor has ever been terminated for default. So, contractor submission of a certification form will gather much more additional information. If you need such a form, you can contact us and we can submit this form to you for you to utilize at your discretion. Okay, now going back to the contractor requirements, and I stipulated the fourth item. One of the things that you may have noticed during our current situation is that people going to Costco and Sam's Club early on were buying cases and cases of water and thousands of rolls of toilet paper. And they were hoarding. And then they were later reselling. Because of that, one of the stipulations, if you're doing sole source, is that you must do a cost-price analysis. Now, if we're buying goods which are normally available on the open market, we would be doing what is, in this case, a subset price analysis, where we compare the price to the norm. Now, let's just hypothesize here that you're contacting a vendor. The vendor knows their sole source. They know that you're facing an emergency situation, and they know that you're isolated, and they think, aha, we've got you. And so they double or triple or quadruple the price. You do your cost price analysis, you identify that the price is exceedingly, grotesquely unwarranted. One of the things that you would be then required to do would be to inform the funding agency that the contractor is acting in an egregious manner and taking advantage of the situation, which in turn would impose the federal government's pressure through FEMA on that contractor. Cost analysis would be done for services. And again, what you would be doing here is describing what the cost would normally be for labor, materials, overhead, profit, and out-of-pocket for a contractor providing a service, such as fumigation, perhaps, of a building. What would it normally cost? Okay, now, cost price analysis would be done for any circumstance over $250,000. So the question that was asked of me earlier, where we were buying protective gowns for $21,000 plus, you're not required to do a cost price analysis because it's not in excess of the simplified acquisition small purchase threshold of $250,000. Now, since I just mentioned contract cost price analysis for services, there is a special prohibition for a contract that occurs oftentimes when you do service contracts. It's called CPPC, or to clarify the acronym, cost plus a percentage of cost. Basically what this is a license for the contractor to steal, because as they get close to finishing, they say, well, you need more work, which gives them more profit, more overhead. This kind of contract has no limit. And so in that kind of contract is prohibited. A related contract called time and materials, or T&M, would be permissible provided that you incorporate two stipulations. One, there must be a ceiling on a time and materials contract. Two, the contractor, once they get to that ceiling, would be awarded only cost and not profit. Okay. Contract also requires that the contractor, during the course of the contract, must submit documentation, and that you, because it is a sole source relationship, must maintain continuous oversight. And that oversight must be clarified and defined in the contract language. Okay, let's go to the next PowerPoint. One of the things that is permissible for us to do is what's called piggybacking. Every one of the states in the United States have been declared an emergency disaster state. Some states more so than others. Some states have done shutdown, lockdown procedures. I believe there are only 7 states that have not done so far. But all of the states have attempted to acquire PPE goods and services. One of the things that you have available to you is to piggyback those states' acquisitions of that PPE goods. And also, all you would need to do would be to contact the state and to obtain the PPE items through the state. A couple of other ones. Notice I stated there, follow-on contracts are required to be competitive and sole source, in all probability, not permitted. And lastly, you must ensure that cost allowability requirements are met. Last week we did a cost allowability webinar, and you can download that by going on to Bill Helmich Associates website, and the 2 prior webinars are capable of being downloaded if you so desire. Furthermore, the PowerPoint slides, if you send us an email request, we can furnish you the PowerPoint slides as PDF documents. Again, a couple of comments here. If you wish to be added to our email list, please send us your email and we will add you for future presentation. Again, if you would, please forward this to others who you feel may be interested in the information. Also, I'll add one more little criteria here. If you have any other subjects that you would like us to prepare materials on, please send us an email and we'll look into it. Thank you for your attendance and stay safe. Bill Helmich of Bill Helmich Associates signing out.
21.
You can see how in a public meeting where they're asking questions, it could be much, 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 much longer.
Oh yeah, right.
It just dominoes.
Sure. No, I understand that.